Alright, so I just wanted to give you a little advice about not chapter 1, but test 1 and what you should be looking for or expecting in test 1. A lot of this, in my personal opinion, is a review from Science 100, so you should have actually seen about everything that we're talking about in the first test, which is why I didn't think individual videos for the chapters were necessary. So when we talk about chapter 1, I just want to move down to the important thing, what you're being tested on is the scientific method. And so you definitely want to go through these slides and understand what the scientific method is. Again, you should have learned this in Science 100, but if you have not, you want to go through, read what the scientific method is, how you do the scientific method, what are the steps, make an observation, asking questions, hypothesis, what is a hypothesis, and you'll need to know things like how you construct one, test one, experiments, designs, understanding that you need an experimental as well as a control, and then you have independent and dependent variables. And so it tells you here that a control group is the variable that's not altered, whereas the experimental group is the variable that is altered. So understanding those terms will help you as you go along to take the exam. And then I do have questions that give you sample experiments, and so it'll give you a scenario like this one does here and ask you questions based upon that. So you should be able to actually read a scenario and understand what the hypothesis is in the scenario, what the control group is, and what the experimental group is. And then data. How about being able to read data would be important. I don't think I asked you any questions on these. And so, as I recall, those are the things that you need to know concerning the scientific method. The next thing you need to concentrate on in chapter 1 is the characteristics of living things. And so, metabolic process, generative processes, responsiveness, control, structural organization, and then the level of biological organization. Please know these. Please, like you can answer a couple of questions and gain a couple of points by knowing this. But also going back and just knowing what are characteristics of life. And if you're asked a question and asked is it living, you should be able to say, well, hey, does it have control? Does it have cells? Is it responsive? Does it have metabolic process? Does it have a generative process, meaning it grows? And if it does, then it's living. If it doesn't, then it's not. And so this goes and tells us the level of biological organization. Here starts with the highest at the biosphere to organism, and then moves on down to the lowest, which is atoms. All right. And so again, being able to see a graph like this and read it would also be helpful. I don't know if I asked one of these, but I do know I like pictures, and so they come into play sometimes. All right. So that's what I think is important, or I know that it's important in chapter 1 when you're taking your exam. Now, I'm not crazy. I do understand you're at home and this is online. So the way I tell my students always to take the test, you may want to have your PowerPoint near you. Hey, I'm not there. It's not like you weren't going to do it anyway. So I would have printed out or had it near me, but you need to have looked through it beforehand because all your exams are timed. And because they are timed, you do not have time to sit here and go through and try and figure out where the answer is. So with you knowing your PowerPoint and basically knowing where things are located, that'll better serve you when you're taking the exam. Alright, looking at chapter 2, here my note says there's not much that I tested on in here except for a few things. So we'll move on straight to that. Again, all of these are things that we would have talked about in Science 100, which is probably I didn't ask about them. But one of the things that I did want to cover, or I know that is covered in here, are these. And it's the 5 important chemical reactions in biology. And probably because we really only in Science 100 hit on acid base. But you want to go through and just be able to recognize in a reaction as an oxidation, or as a dehydration, or hydrolysis, phosphorylation, or an acid base. And so it's not going to be where you have to look at any type of chemical formula, but basically having general knowledge of what those reactions do would help you with chapter 2. not many questions coming from it. So if you don't get to cover it, you'd probably still be okay with missing that 1 or 2 questions. Now what we want to do is chapter 3, and I think this is, looking at my notes, says you really should look at the figures in here. This is all something that you've talked about because we've gone through it in your lab. So looking at organic chemistry, I said you should look at the figures, knowing that anything organic has carbon and hydrogen backbone, and so this is what a backbone looks like. And then you can add other things to that backbone, like you can put an oxygen off of here, methyl groups off of here, but this stretch down the bottom through the middle will always have carbons with hydrogens coming off of it. Alright, and so macromolecules of life, you've gone over these in your lab and they show up again. So from your lab to your lab exam to this lecture, you should be able to answer every question that has to do with the macromolecules of life. So you will have questions based upon carbohydrates, proteins, nucleic acids, and lipids. And so knowing what the polymers are for each one of those, as well as what the monomer is, meaning the big name for them as well as the small name. So simple sugars, right, is what it started out as carbohydrates, things like glucose, fructose, and galactose. Then we move to disaccharides and trisaccharides, and then the major or the large is called a polysaccharide. Complex carbohydrates, proteins, knowing that they are made of amino acids, it's their monomer, and then a polypeptide would be the polymer, and knowing that they have 4 structures in proteins: primary, secondary, tertiary, and quaternary. And then there are different types of proteins. Then knowing your nucleic acids, that there are 2 of them, DNA and RNA. And again, you really should have seen this in Science 100. But DNA and RNA nucleotides are the monomers, and DNA and RNA are the polymers. And so knowing this, how a nucleotide is made: 5 carbon sugar, phosphate group, nitrogenous group. And then knowing that DNA is a double helix, you should never not know that it has 2 strands associated with it. That DNA is chromosomes, it replicates itself, so on and so forth. And then RNA, and knowing the same, and that there are 3 different types. So I know I'm moving through this. Again, I'm only giving you information on where you should concentrate your studies when you're looking to take the exam or prepare yourself for the exam. So knowing what lipids are and what they are composed of, knowing the difference between saturated and unsaturated. Again, I like figures. So you see here that we have unsaturated as well as saturated. I'm sorry, something got caught in my throat. But unsaturated has a double bond, whereas saturated does not. And so if you look at the figure, if you remember from Science 100, double bonds are 2 lines within, whereas single bonds are just 1 line between the carbon. And so if that's the case, this will be unsaturated and that will be saturated. So knowing that will help you out. And then, of course, phospholipids found in the cell membrane and how they are made. Alright, and then that overview is always a good thing for you to take note of. And so out of chapter 3, looking at figures of organic structure, the structure of macromolecules, and then figure of saturated and unsaturated should help you with the exam. And then last but not least is chapter 4. And chapter 4, this pretty much sums it up. The summary of cell organelles and their functions. Now this may give you the minimal, which would help if you already have a great idea about the cell. If not, I would suggest that you take a walk through the cell and understand all of the different organelles that are present, because really that's what the test does. It just walks you through and asks you things about all of the different organelles that you see here. So your membranous, non-membranous organelles, the ribosome, skeleton, cytoskeleton, centrioles, cilia, flagella, and inclusions. And so you should know those, your energy molecules, your mitochondria and chloroplasts. And this looks weird because I'm scrolling backwards through your PowerPoint instead of forward. So don't get confused. Just start at the bottom and I worked my way back to the top. Alright, the nuclear membrane, vesicles and vacuoles, peroxisomes, lysosomes, Golgi, the endoplasmic reticulum, the plasma membrane, and there you go. So these are all the organelles that compose the cell, and you should know which each one of those does, because as I said, it's just a laundry list. The thing about biology is that it's memorization, really. If you were sitting in a classroom exam, it would be that you went home and read your book and you memorized all of these things. You're at an advantage because you have everything there with you, but it's just you being able to get to it quickly and know it because you're timed. And I can't say it any more than I have already said. It is timed. So no matter how much you like, oh, I'm at home, I got everything here, I'm not going to study. Okay, do that. And your grade will reflect. But if you really want to get a decent grade, you probably should take time to go through all of the PowerPoints, familiarize yourself with things, so that some things you can answer quickly, and then other things you only have to come back and say, okay, let me take a look at that right quick. Okay? Alright, everybody, good luck on it, and I'll see you on the other side.